Hi, I am making a video because I want to explain kind of in a as quick as I can what's been going on with me for the past 2+ years. I feel like there's a lot of friends and family who have questions, who aren't really in the loop, and or if they are in the loop, they haven't really had a chance to hear it from the horse's mouth, and I haven't had a chance to explain myself. Um, I've been hoping that I could do that on my blog, but I've kind of realized that in my blog there's just so much that I want to talk about, and I want to do it in chronological order. So it's not really feasible for me to do it in a way that's quick. And it will probably take me over a year to get through everything that I want to talk about. Um, for those of you who don't know, this is a blog called Charged LBH that I started when I moved to China first, and it was just intended as a blog that would be my life as an expatriate in China and talking about what's interesting about life there. Um, and Sometimes I go on a tangent, but for the most part, that's what it is. I didn't want it to be like a live journal where it's going to always be my life. I kind of intended it as a beginning and end sort of blog. So I'm planning on seeing that through to completion. And then, I don't know, maybe I'll pick it back up again if I ever go abroad again, or maybe I'll just start a new blog. I haven't decided. Anyway, that's really not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to start with basically changing jobs in China. When I first moved there, during the honeymoon phase, you'll hear a lot of expatriates talk about having a honeymoon phase where they really love living in this new country and everything seems great and they think, I want to live here forever. I was starting to get out of that phase, and I was starting to think, okay, we'll give this another year or two. But, at the same time, I was making a lot of money. I was really enjoying myself. I felt very safe. That's one thing that we used to always talk about. China is such a safe country to go to. Um, so I switched jobs. And by the way, I'm going to try to not use names of any schools or any people, even if it's like people in the media. Like, maybe if I'm talking about Joe Biden, I'll say his name, but otherwise, I kind of want to keep it anonymous. I was working at what they call a training center, which I thought it was a school when I got there. Training centers are this phenomena in China where they like after school places where kids can go for an hour or two once a week, twice a week, depending on whatever they want to do, and study. In my case, English, but you could do also like math or science or anything like that. And I was working in a situation like that. I got a better job offer from another school. And I was already kind of fed up with things like they would, for example, I was contracted to be with the students for an hour. But they told the parents I was with the students for 2 hours. So after that first hour, they would have me leave the classroom and go teach in another one, or just hang out, and hang out in an empty classroom and play on my phone for an hour, while they basically just yelled at the kids to memorize their spelling words. Things like that was just not really what I wanted to be doing. I think when you are in education, you try to be the sort of environment that you would like the world to look like. And Obviously, I didn't want to have that kind of dishonesty. I changed jobs, and that was a really involved process. I learned that these people who I always thought were my friends were very much not my friends as soon as I switched from one job to another. As soon as I told them I didn't want to work for them anymore, suddenly they were going to do anything within their power to keep me there. Because it is really hard to convince someone to drop everything they have going on in their life and move to a country where they don't know anyone and don't speak the language and go work there. And I can understand why. Not to foreshadow, but after what I've been through, yeah, I would never just pick a job from an advert and say, sure, yeah, let's try it and move to another country. So anyway, they fought very dirty to try to keep me working there, and that culminated in them trying to have one of the foreigners who worked at the school that I was planning to work on. They tried to get him deported. They couldn't because he was there legally. There was nothing they could do, but they sent officers to his house to go bother him a bunch, and it freaked his wife out, and it was terrible. So I did finally change jobs, and it was, a really unpleasant process, and I had to not work for like a month, and my money was kind of starting to run out, and I was not happy. So I switched to this other job. A lot of the issues that I saw with my last school that I assumed was just like, oh, these are just crummy people. I was starting to see maybe this is actually just how they treat foreign employees in China, or maybe this is just how they do business in China. Things like not having a big concern for child safety. I think at every job I had in China, I saw somebody leave a box cutter on a table where a kid could easily grab it and stick it into their face if they wanted to. Things like that. Yeah, it was just kind of starting to realize that the issues that I was seeing in my first employer were maybe not going away with my second employer, and maybe even worse in some situations. Like, one thing I will say about my first employer, if I ever had an issue with like my toilet backed up, I knew I could just call them and they would take care of it, which is huge when you don't speak a language. I still don't know how to say my toilet backed up in Chinese. So, you were kind of at the mercy of your employer to help you with stuff like that when you're in China. And unfortunately, I was not getting that help at that job. And I was still mostly okay with it. I mentioned this on my blog, but there was a huge issue with, and this is something that is very common in China. Kids, they asked all the kids to bring an animal to school with them because they were having state inspections and they wanted to show that they had a lot of classroom pets. So you had 300 plus kids bringing goldfish and turtles and birds and gerbils and salamanders. I think even a couple of kids brought rabbits, and obviously nobody has the kind of power to take care of that many animals when you're also taking care of kids, and the kind of unspoken expectation is we'll just kind of let them die, and move on. And I really couldn't do that. I can't teach a classroom while I'm noticing everywhere all around the classroom animals are slowly starving to death. That's not okay. And so that was a big ordeal. And I don't even really like talking about it anymore. If you want to, you can check it out on my blog. So anyway, my last week working there, it was the last week of the semester. We were doing assessments. I was just staying so busy that I hadn't even seen the news. My father had invited me to go to Hawaii with him, and I was really planning on taking those 2 weeks off. Everyone gets 2 weeks off for Chinese New Year, and my plan was to spend that time to kind of edit my book and try to make it better and get it to a point where I thought it was ready for submission to publishers. My father invited me to Hawaii, so I kind of said, okay, well, I'll go for a week and then I'll just really bust my ass when I get back to China and edit the book in a week. That was January of 2020. So you can imagine I went to Oahu, spent a week, saw the news for the first time in a while, realized that, oh, I might not want to go back to China. And so I made the decision to just stay in the States for a while and kind of see how things shook out, and then I'd go back. Well, things got worse in China, and then they got better in China, and then they got really bad in the USA, and pretty soon I couldn't go back to China even if I wanted to, which I did. Like I left my apartment with the expectation I would be gone to Hawaii for a week. And the whole China was on lockdown. So all the animals, like I still had the last classroom pets that I was able to save in my apartment. They all, the way you leave your apartment when you expect to be back in a week is much different if you don't know when you're going to be back. It might be years. And I really did not bring things back the way I would have if I didn't think I was going to come back. So I still had a lot of stuff that I had planned on keeping with me, forever, that I'd left in China. So I had to go back. While I was here, though, while I was in the USA, I got a job substitute teaching. That lasted for a month or two, and then the schools all shut down because we were on lockdown here. I started working at a succulent nursery that one of my really good friends, who actually, he got married today, and he didn't, I found out from my mom, who heard it from his mom. I don't know if there's some animosity there or if he just I haven't been really good at keeping up with him either. So I think maybe it's just kind of the way things shook out. I'm hoping he's not angry with me. Anyway, so he is the vice president of a succulent plant nursery, and I worked there while I was going to school, and I loved it. Like I really thought about dropping out and just working with plants for the rest of my life. So I went back there, and it was just a very different vibe. A lot of the friends that I'd made while I was there had moved on. A lot of the people who replaced them had a very different outlook on life and a very different sense of humor, and it was just a very different vibe, and I was really kind of shocked by how unhappy I was there. And that really culminated with, I thought maybe it would be better. They had someone from their customer service department quit. And I thought maybe it would be better if I went into customer service. Maybe it's just not the right scene. That was a silly decision. Who wants to, get into customer service because they're having trouble dealing with people? And I really... I had to apologize to my friend. I feel terrible about how I didn't take customer service seriously. I think if you're working at Little Caesars or something and you decide to be a bit cheeky, okay, but when it's your best friend's company and it's something that he's put blood, sweat, and tears into, I feel like I did him a disservice, especially since he was willing to give me a job on the, kind of on the fly when I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I need a job where if I need to leave, I can go back to China and quit, and it's not a big deal. Like I came to him with a pretty tall order, and he hooked me up, and then I feel like I kind of spit it back in his face. But anyway, um, I was able to live off the stimulus check. I was doing okay, and I was actually really doing a lot of things with my life that I'd always wanted to do, like recording music and playing music, and I was really excited about all that. But that's about the time that I got to go back to China. One more thing that I wanted to mention while I was here was I started joining a writers group, which was wonderful. And if anyone from that writers group is listening, I really have always enjoyed, I think that was at my most productive and most quality, my most quality of being a writer. That sounds like someone who should be a writer. Can't even think of like an adjective that means quality. Anyway, my best writing came from being in that writing group and just thinking like a writer all the time. We met once a week on Saturdays, and it was mostly older than me women. And, that, like, I think you could look at that and think, oh man, that must really be terrible for him to have to hang out with but they were just so accepting. I would write stories with all kinds of foul language and queer characters and XYZ, and they were always just eating it up. It was great. And, furthermore, I think it's so neat when you can bond with someone who has had a different life to yours and you find something that you're both interested in. You're like, oh, you like motorcycles. I like motorcycles too. We have this thing that we can connect over. If you are watching this and you're a writer, I really hope you can find a writers group that was as uplifting as the one that I was part of. Anyway, and we kept on doing that over the lockdown over Zoom, which was great. But anyway, so one of the women in that writers group wrote this really wonderful piece about learning that she had ADHD when she was 65 years old, and learning how to talk about how, like, if you're in a conversation with someone and your mind starts to wander and they're talking to you about something really important to them and you're thinking about flamenco dancing, and that doesn't mean that you're not being a good friend. It means that you have ADHD, or maybe you don't, but in her case she did, and that was why her brain did that. And so, yeah, anyway, it was a great piece. And so I said, okay, I want to go get tested for ADHD because that sounds like an experience that I have all the friggin' time. So I did, and literally, I love to tell this story. The doctor had like a piece of paper with a chart on it, and he literally had to hover his hand above the piece of paper because my inattentive ADHD was so high that it wasn't on the graph. For hyperactive ADHD, I scored very low. And so I hear all the time, oh, you can't have ADHD, you're not hyperactive. And I get that the fact that that's how we classify ADD as inattentive type ADHD is weird now and whatever. Um, but anyway, so I went through a process that I think a lot of adults who get diagnosed with neurodivergency or any manner of thing go through, where the more I read about it, the more I was like, yes, that is something I've been struggling with my whole life and I've never internalized it. Actually, today, I just remembered is the anniversary of me getting diagnosed. So 2 years as of today. Um, so, like I've always felt like there was this weird mental issue that has been keeping me from being a functional adult and keeping me from being a productive adult. And yes, I can write a book in a month, but I can't do my dishes in 6 months. And when I try, without even realizing it, suddenly I'm changing the lug nuts on my neighbor's car and reading about how to do that online. And I almost like don't even realize how I got there. Um, Stuff like that. So anyway, with that knowledge, I moved back to China, and now I really was thinking, okay, I'll give it another year, save up some money, and then come back. Because my doctor, and granted, I'm not crazy about, I feel like treating with drugs should be done with caution, and I was a little bit alarmed with how my doctor said, "Oh, you got ADHD. Okay, here's a prescription for Adderall." Like, okay, are we gonna, explore options at least? But he gave me a prescription for Adderall, and I said, "Well, I'm moving back to China in 2 weeks. Adderall is illegal there, so why would we even want to fool around with this for 2 weeks?" Um, so I think I did like talk about trying it, but just getting the process of getting Adderall prescriptions with Medi-Cal and everything, it was like by the time that all that paperwork gets cleared, I'm going to be back in China. So I said, okay, I'm back in China. I can't try drugs to treat ADHD, but I have a lot of non-drug coping ideas. And I had to switch therapists because there's a rule that you cannot practice therapy outside the state you live in. Um, and I initially started seeing or was talking about seeing another therapist, and I just kind of never got around to it. So I was flying solo for a while, which is okay. Um, but anyway, so I was back at the same job at the same school, and things were really starting to fall apart. I mean, there was, I think, a real miscommunication. I was, you know, never able to get the tools to do what I wanted to do, and suffering from weird, like serious fatigue. Like I would get to school, I would take a quick nap in school, which is very normal in China to like people take naps on the sidewalk. Um, at least in the region, I should always mention, whenever I say, oh, this is a thing that people do in China, China is a huge country. So if I say people take naps on the sidewalk in China, what I really mean is people take naps on the sidewalk in the region of China where I lived. I have no idea what life is like outside of that region, and it could be completely different. But anyway, yeah, I would go to school, take a quick nap before I started classes, take a nap between classes, go home after school, hop right into bed and go to sleep, sleep all day and get up in the morning. And still, I wasn't getting enough sleep. So I've never figured out what that was, but it was terrible. Um, Other things that were issues, they'd let someone else into my apartment when I was gone. They'd let someone start living there, and she left a bunch of trash and a bunch of her stuff that I guess she didn't want. And there was a bunch of my stuff, all my kitchen stuff. I guess she took it with her. I don't know how. Um, a blanket that I really liked, I lost. So, that was kind of crappy of them, and they were not very apologetic about it. Um, just very like, and like when I came to them and I said, I feel like we're having difficulty communicating, let's try to work things out. Uh, they would, like, I literally said that to someone, and she just didn't respond. And then a couple of days later, she said, the parents of our students think you watch too many videos in class, which, at that time, I think she made a kind of severe case. What I'd kind of realized is that my students, I decided I kind of wanted to really get them invested in phonics. So we would do phonics songs every day, and I would cycle through all the letters. And uh, unfortunately, with 4 letters a day and 20 minutes a day, that eats up a lot of time from your lesson. I mean, that's about 10 minutes. That's about half your lesson is doing songs. And yes, there were correlating videos to those songs. Anyway, the fact that she totally disregarded what I said, but bossed me around really, put me in a sour mood. And I was really just, yeah, not happy at that job for a lot of reasons. Not all of them were the fault of the school, and just really needing help. I actually just mentioned in my blog that while I was there, they completely changed how they do trash collection, and now they expected everyone to sort their garbage. And they had hired people to stand with the garbage cans all day and make sure you sorted your garbage correctly. And I never figured out the system. Like you were supposed to scan something with your phone. I don't know. I didn't get it. So every time I took out my garbage, I would kind of get sassed by the woman who was working there. And I was asking for help with that, and I wouldn't. And when you're in a situation where you can't even take out your own damn trash, excuse my French, that's pretty serious. Okay, great. I thought I was almost done, and I accidentally didn't record over half of what I said, so we'll start over on that. Isn't that fun? So I guess I'll just kind of back up a bit. So my friend, the foreigner who actually was the same foreigner who got hassled by the police when my first boss tried to get him deported, he got hassled by the police again, and he got taken to a holding cell because the way it works in China is your work visa allows you to only work at the address specified on the visa. The school where I worked had a satellite campus, and he would go over there once a week to teach really little 2-year-old kids. And basically, he would do a little 15-minute lesson with them. And it was really just kind of getting them introduced to the concept of a language that wasn't Chinese because they were very young. Um, and actually, yeah, I did that too with some of the younger kids who were on our main campus, and it was really fun. But he did it at the other campus because he happened to have a car and a Chinese driver's license. Well, that, as it turns out, was against the law. So my boss, they called her in there because she was hiring him to do things that were against the law. And her initial plan was to completely steamroll him. She originally claimed to the police officer that she had no idea that he was doing this. He was doing it of his own volition. And she was shocked and never would have told him to do that. And obviously, no, he wouldn't do that of his own volition. No one is like, hey, I need to go teach more and get paid for it, but you don't know about you're paying me. So, luckily the police officer saw right through that. Well, the boss is still very well connected and wealthy, and luckily he was married to a woman who's connected, whose family is very well connected and wealthy. So he was able to get out of there okay. But the fact that she was able to, or willing to steamroll him like that, made me decide that I didn't want to work there anymore. I've already mentioned that when you're living in China, you're dependent on your employer for a lot of stuff. And if you can't trust them, then you are in a very dangerous situation. And I didn't want to play that game anymore. So I started looking for another job. My friend, who's actually the wife of the guy who got taken into holding, had a friend who was a recruiter. And when you get a job in China, it's almost always through a recruiting agent who connects foreign teachers to schools. And they're just like a middleman. You usually don't directly go through a school. But the recruiter, she said, this is my friend, you can trust him. He set me up with a training center, which, again, I mentioned what a training center was, and I didn't really want to work there. I wanted to work at a school because training centers, you get out of it what you put into it, but it's regarded as more of a Mickey Mouse sort of job, and I didn't want to do that. Plus, you don't. The way training centers work is since the kids have another school they're going to, you work weekends all day, and then you work 3 more days during the week, and then you get 2 weekdays off. And I think I was getting Tuesday and Wednesday off, which didn't sync up with the schedule of the woman I was dating. I don't know if the part with the woman I was dating got cut off or not, but I was dating a woman in Shanghai. And that actually kind of plays into when I told the boss at the second school that I was quitting. I didn't want to say I'm quitting because I don't trust you and I want to get the hell out of here, because I didn't want to stir the pot. So yeah, I said I was going to move to Shanghai to be with my girlfriend. She was not my girlfriend ever. We were casually dating. She is a Russian woman who was married in China and in a really crummy relationship with, just very Chinese people expect a very specific thing from a marriage, and it changes where you are in China. But especially in Shanghai, the women are expected to kind of run the life for the man. And the man's job is to make a bunch of money and then bring it to the wife to take care of. So she didn't want that, and she got out of it. And I started dating her, and so I did kind of tell sort of a fib. I did call her my girlfriend, which she was not. And said I was moving to Shanghai to be closer to her, which wasn't untrue, but that was certainly not the main reason I was moving to Shanghai. I did not actually move to Shanghai proper. I moved to Jiaxing, which is a city that's pretty close to Shanghai. Although I think probably most people in Jiaxing have only been to Shanghai once or twice, and most people in Shanghai have never been to Jiaxing, because Shanghai, it's kind of like New York City, where there's people who they say this city has everything. Why would I ever want to leave? Plus, why can you afford to leave? And that was another, like, there were a lot of things about this job that were not ideal. I wanted to move to Shanghai proper because I was done with being in a situation where I constantly had to fend for myself with a giant language barrier. And I've mentioned this before, like the taxi drivers in Shanghai speak better English than the English speakers in most places in China. It's just a very, it's called an international city. It's got a very different vibe. It feels like it's almost a different country than the rest of China. So I took this job because, again, this recruiter was recommended by a friend, and the recruiter assured me this was a really great place to work, and they were super honest. And the friend assured me it was a really great place to work, and the owner was super honest, and I could trust this recruiter. And they also offered me 30,000 yuan after taxes, which is over $5,000 a month. At least it was at the time. I think the yuan has taken a bit of a dive. So I couldn't, it all sounded like, okay. There were a couple of minor red flags, but it wasn't ideal. But I was like, okay, I can work here and just kind of keep my head down and make a whole lot of money, and then send it home, and then send myself home, and we'll be good. The first major red flag that I experienced working at this job was when I got taken into the police station and put in a holding cell and sat in, I forget what those chairs are called, where they restrain you, and questioned. Why? Because it turned out I was working under the wrong kind of visa. I was working under what's called a humanitarian visa as opposed to a work visa. That was stupid of me. And I actually was totally unaware that I was doing that. This was really silly of me to do, but I looked at the visa they gave me. My boss is filing all this paperwork for me with the office because nobody speaks English and I have no idea what's going on. And I get the visa back and I'm like, oh, that looks funny. They must have changed the way they do visas. And that was all I thought about it. I got questioned. I was there. They took me in it was on a Sunday, and they hauled me in at 11. And it was a holiday, I think, because I wasn't at work. They came to my apartment. They hauled me in at around 11 a.m. And I didn't get home till about 11 p.m. And that's a whole story, being questioned and all that. But my boss eventually did come and talk to them and got me out of there. I'm guessing he paid a bribe. I don't know what else he could have done. They told me I was being fined 12,000 yuan. My boss agreed to take care of it, which frankly I think he should have, since it was my fault I was in there. But I was arrested. And even afterwards, the police came to my place a couple of times to kind of ask qualifying questions or get me to sign things or whatever. And one time I remember they said, hey, can you get your boss for us? Because we've had trouble contacting him and he owes us some money. That should have been a red flag. And it was, but I I was still thinking like, okay, he's going to want to keep me happy because I know that I'm worth a lot to him. I'm a white American teacher, and if he can brag about having a white American teacher, that's going to keep his school, that's going to keep a lot of parents of his students very happy. So they're going to pay to keep his school open, and so he's going to want to keep me happy. I'm going to send a bunch of money home and then send myself home, and we'll give it a few more months. Around late November, he told me he could help me send some money home, which is something that I needed to do. I'd been needing to do it. I had credit cards that I needed to pay off and couldn't. And I tried, there's an app that's very common in China called Alipay or Alipay. I'm not sure, probably just depends on how you want to say it. And with Alipay, supposedly you could send money abroad, but every time I tried to do it, it didn't work. And so he said he could help me send some money home. So this is a moment I've replayed in my head a million times and just wished I'd done something differently. We went to a bank and he had a personal goon who drove him around and stuff. I handed the goon a whole month's salary, 30,000 yuan. And I thought we were gonna talk to a teller and do a MoneyGram transaction stuff. That's why I had it in cash. Before I could say no, he stuck it in an ATM and tried to send the money over Alipay. And I thought, okay, well, it's going to bounce back just like it did every other time I tried it with anyone else. But then he'll give me the money back. And you've probably already figured out that he never did. And it was always like, oh, the bank needs to wait for the transaction to process. It's going to be 40 business days, And I would talk to friends in China and they said, oh yeah, that sounds right. So I kept on giving him the benefit of the doubt. I think I was keeping the business afloat for another month because at that point he wasn't making any money. He was borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. We knew very little about this. I mean, I kind of when the police were saying, hey, he owes us money, the police in China aren't people who you can just stiff. So if he owes them money, then it's probably not good. But I didn't realize what dire straits he was in. And he stopped paying all his foreign workers. And we went to the Labor Department. They had us file a bunch of paperwork. They said, well, we'll let you know. We had to keep going there. I kept on going into work this whole time because I was under the impression that if I didn't go into work, my visa would terminate and I could get deported. I didn't want that to happen. I've since learned that that's not how that would have worked, but that's another story. Finally, it got to the point where all these excuses of, oh, the bank's holding on to money because there's new regulations, but I'll get it to you by this date. It just kept on happening and happening. And finally, we just stopped going in. And that was a totally uncoordinated thing. He said he'd pay us by February. I still remember the day because it was such a thing. February 25th, he said he'd pay us and he didn't. So all the foreign employees just stopped going in. Soon after that, and this is a guy who owns 2 cars and one of them is a Mercedes-Benz. This isn't, he was not good with money, but he was good at looking like he had money. I heard through the grapevine that he was trying to sell the company. Uh, then there was a lockdown. This was around the time the lockdown started happening in Shanghai. We weren't in Shanghai, but what happened was they closed all the training centers. So there was no way for him to make money anymore. Um, this was around the time he stopped paying all his employees. Now he wasn't paying anyone. And, um, that kind of dissolved. And I was at a point where I was on my last, I had less than 600 yuan, so less than $100. And I hate that I had to do this so much, but I called my parents and asked them to borrow money. And I borrowed about 3 grand from them. They had to send it to China. I had to go to the bank, and if you've ever been to a bank in China, it takes hours and hours to do things like this. But I got the money, and that same day I hired a lawyer, and she was able to get the documents that I needed from him to quit. Um, when a foreign employee quits in China, there's all these documents that they need from their old boss. But unfortunately, their old boss can whine and stamp their feet and act really petty and refuse to give them the documents. This whole time, he wanted to keep it looking like, at least looking like I was working there, because that would make the company look more valuable while he was trying to sell it. And then I even had a job that I was going to take in another province. Legally, to work in another province, I would need a letter of recommendation from him. There was no legal precedence for him to have to give me that document. So I had the lawyer talk to him. I had my recruiter talk to him. Everyone refused. He refused everyone. He refused to give me that letter of recommendation out of spite. Nothing more. He'd given me all the documents he had to. He could no longer claim I was working there. He just wanted to be petty. Luckily, eventually I did find a job at another school in that same city, so I didn't have to get that letter of recommendation from him. And I could start working there. The final word on him getting sued and me getting my money back is I got a message from the Labor Bureau saying, hey, we've done an investigation, and yeah, it looks like he owes you a lot of money along with everyone else in town. We're going to liquidate his assets, and you can get a piece of that pie. So if I ever see any money from him, it's going to be less than 1% of what he owes me, probably. And the money that he stole from me to send to the US, that's just gone. There's nothing I can do about it. So this next school that I was working at is a international school with branches all over the world. They're based out of England, and it's the kind of place where, like, if you're a foreign diplomat and you want to send your son to an English school because you're an English foreign diplomat and you're working in Thailand, you can send your kid there and know they're going to get a good education. It was a school with a really good reputation, and one where I was like, oh, this will be cool, because if I work here and I have a good reference from this company, then I could go work at one of their schools in the Philippines or Japan or the USA. I started working there, and that was a whole process, of course. And I should mention, when you work in China as a foreign teacher, they either give you a stipend to pay for an apartment, or they just give you an apartment. So this apartment, I was living in an apartment that was being paid for by this school that was not paying me. And finally, the landlord tried to evict me, and they shut off my power. And so, I called the new place where I was going to work and said, hey, I need to move. I don't have electricity. Um, they got me a much nicer apartment, and it was a 3 bedroom, which is ridiculous. Like, I do like having an extra bedroom to be my office, but I do not need a guest room. That's ridiculous. Anyway, so they got me this much nicer apartment and moved me in and everything, but I had to pay for it. And that's out of the money that I borrowed from my parents because I still hadn't gotten a check from them. So I start working there and, fill out all the forms and apply for my visa and everything. And on my first day, they said, okay, so that salary that we agreed on, that starts in a few months. Until then, you're going to be teaching classes to struggling readers, and we're going to pay you by the lesson. And it's going to be about $20 for each lesson you teach. I went home, I did the math. Oh, and by the way, we're not going to pay your rent for you until you start working as a full teacher. I went home, I did the math, and it was, after rent, I was only going to be making a few hundred yuan a month. And that was, so I was told that on a Friday. That Friday and Saturday and Sunday, I didn't eat because I was just so devastated. I thought I'd finally found a way out of this pickle, and now they're nickel and diming me, and I'm going to be living hand to mouth for months until my class starts. And I was pretty sure it was over then. That next week I went to work, and then on top of everything else, they said, oh, hey, I know we scheduled you for a class, but we totally forgot it's sports day. So the kids are going to go play basketball. So you don't have lessons, and that means we're not paying you. I was like, you said you were going to, like, you can't undo me putting a shirt on and getting out of bed and coming down here. That's messed up. So anyway, at that point, it looked like it was over, especially since they didn't tell me until I'd already signed a contract with them, and that's something that I've seen happen a lot in negotiations in China, where they get you to agree to something but do not give you all the details, like, hey, can you help us with this extra lesson? And you're like, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to help with that. And then they say, okay, you agreed to, so you're going to come in on Sunday and you're not going to get paid for it, that kind of stuff. So anyway, I was in a pretty bad place already. And this was the whole time this lockdown is going on. Like I mentioned that I was dating a woman. I was actually dating a couple of different women by this point, just casual stuff. And they were both great in their own way. One of them was Chinese and the other was Russian. Last I checked, they still are. But the lockdown was going on, so no one could get in or out of Shanghai. Everyone I knew was surviving, but not doing much better. My Russian friend who I was dating, her company was getting her food delivery, so she at least had food, but she had no say over what kind of food she got. And so it was stuff like they gave her one dead duck carcass, which that's pretty nice thing to actually have if you are familiar with how to cook Chinese food. But if you are from Russia and you don't eat a lot of duck, that's not something you're used to being presented with and saying, here, eat this. And she was doing a lot better than a lot of people. There were a lot of people who were starving. There were people who were dying. All the hospitals were full of COVID patients because if you tested positive, you had to go to a hospital or a detention center or something like that. It was kind of complicated. So, if you, God forbid, had an aneurysm or something, you were just out of luck because they were using the hospitals to get rid of COVID. It was a huge, really scary situation. And in the midst of all this, I'm still like, it's time to go home. But God, I had all these things I wanted to do before I left. Couldn't I just stay a few more months and kind of do one or two of those things? Couldn't I at least say goodbye to my friends? There are a couple of sources that I really like for information about Chinese news and politics. As you can imagine, it's really difficult to find political news about China that's not extremely biased. There's a lot of different people with very strong biases reporting on China. That's putting it as broadly and objectively as possible. And I have a couple of sources who are YouTubers that, if you are familiar with life in China and YouTube, you probably know who I'm talking about. They do a podcast. I was listening to it pretty religiously at that point because we all wanted to find out what was going on with this lockdown and what was going to happen. During this particular podcast, one of them said, if you are a foreigner living in China right now, I would really, really recommend that you start making plans to leave. And that was kind of the message I'd always said, okay, if I hear something like that from one of these people, then it's time to leave. It really is. And so I left that same week. I bought a plane ticket, which was outrageously expensive. And actually, I guess as long as I'm admitting to borrowing money from my parents, I had to borrow money for that plane ticket too, because I couldn't afford it on what I had left from what I borrowed from them. And there's a whole other story there, because getting through a city that's totally on lockdown where no one can leave their home, and there wasn't any instructions on how to get from the train station in Shanghai to the airport. You just had to go on hearsay. If I was stranded, what would I do? They would come find me and take me to jail for being out during the lockdown. It was a very scary situation. And I think if I had to do it over again, I might have, traveled to Beijing or somewhere that wasn't on lockdown and then flown out of there, but whatever. Anyway, so I got home and I was pretty devastated. And I basically, for almost a month, didn't talk to anyone except for my parents. Didn't travel, didn't leave my little house. They have a little, we call it a bunkhouse out back behind their main house, and I kind of moved in my stuff there and just kind of hung out there and didn't do anything, and I was depressed. And I finally kind of started coming out of my shell and applying to jobs. I was really not looking forward to talking to anyone, but at the same time, I wanted to get my life back together as quickly as possible. It took me almost a month just to get a stupid phone subscription, because I decided to go with Google Fi, and I guess their phones were back ordered or something. And plus I was trying to get my old phone number, which if you do travel abroad, I realize it costs a lot to pay for a cell phone service that you're not using, but keeping your number in this day and age is really helpful. So think about it. So anyway, I finally did kind of start putting my life together. And I had this sort of deadline, which was the 4th of July. My parents have, not every year, but pretty regularly held a family reunion for my father's side of the family at their cattle ranch on the 4th of July. And, it's kind of at a point where I have several relatives in their 90s. We don't know how much longer they're going to be with us. I hate to think like that, but that's how we have to think, unfortunately. And so I was still in a situation where I really didn't want to see anyone, but all these people were coming for the 4th of July, and what was I going to do? Go get an Airbnb somewhere, So I really wanted to have my life back together by the 4th of July, and I had that kind of deadline. And I got a few job offers for teaching positions, and I had in my head kind of where I wanted to live. And it wasn't LA, and it wasn't the San Francisco Bay Area. Nothing against LA or the San Francisco Bay Area. I just, didn't want to deal with that cost of living. So I got a job offer from a school in Sacramento. And when I went and interviewed at the school and I did a demo lesson, I didn't get really great vibes. And I remember leaving thinking, if I don't get called back from this school, I won't be surprised, but I also won't be disappointed. But I actually did get called back and offered a job. And it was like kind of a long time after the interview, so I strongly suspect I wasn't their first choice. But I got the job offer, and so I took it. So now I need to get to Sacramento because I'm going to start working as a teacher soon. And I came down here. I stayed in a hostel for a couple of days and just checked out apartments. It was actually really hard to find just an apartment that wasn't like part of this huge complex. I kept on going to these places that like had a pool and a fitness center and all this stuff. And I was like, no, I just want a normal apartment. And finally I found one, and it's very nice, and it's in a really nice neighborhood. And considering the neighborhood it's in, the rent is really cheap, and it's really spacious, and it's a fraction of what these other apartments that I was looking at. So that was good. But I moved in 2 days before I was supposed to start work. And I have not lived in the United States, at least not in the sense that I was really like permanently here for years now. So I didn't have much of anything. I had like books and stuff that I wanted to save, or record collection and stuff that I'd kind of left with my parents because in a storage unit, because I wanted to hold on to it. But I didn't have a bed. My first week or so working here, I slept on the floor. Now I have an air mattress, which they say that you're not supposed to use the air mattress as a permanent bed on the box, but it's not like police come to your house and check to make sure you're not doing it. So I didn't have any furniture. I really didn't have kind of the things you need to live in an apartment. And I'm trying to get that all together. Plus I'm starting a new job. Plus I'm trying to get a classroom together. Plus I was absolutely sucker punched by how expensive everything had gotten in the US. Remember, I left all my stuff at my apartment in China. anything that I thought I could get again, or anything that I really didn't have space for, or anything that I just didn't feel like I needed to hold on to, I left inside the apartment. Um, and so, like, on my father had just had knee surgery, and part of that was he had to walk around a lot. And I said, okay, well, he came to pick me up from the airport, and he told me that. And I said, well, that's great. Like, why don't we just stop at a Target on the way home, and I'll pick up the things that I need, because I don't have any more underwear now. And so we stopped, and I got some stuff, but I couldn't believe underwear is a great example. The brand of underwear like had jumped up to over $20 for two pair. I can't afford that. And so I'm moving into a new apartment and needing to buy furniture and stuff, and needing to set up a classroom, and there's all kinds of stuff that I need for my classroom. I mean, if you're a teacher, you know that you're lucky if you're provided with the bare minimum, which I was provided with the bare minimum. They gave me some crayons and some stacked cubes and some things like that. So I spent a lot of money on counting bears and calendars and all the stuff that makes a classroom fun. But basically, the picture I'm trying to paint here is I had a lot of really big tasks, really expensive tasks all at once. And I was very busy and spending a lot more money than I intended to, even with all the ways I was trying to save. And meanwhile, I'm going through 2 weeks of orientation to work at this new school. And this is a charter school that is kind of trying to do things a different way. It was started by someone who got a lot of money and went into politics and tried to kind of revitalize their community. Again, if you're from Sacramento, you probably know exactly who I'm talking about. But anyway, so we're at this orientation, and the first day, like, they're taking us around to all these other community projects that this organization owns, and it's stuff like a theater and a bookstore, and they take us to a restaurant and have everyone, they say, well, this restaurant, we're really famous for our Kool-Aid, so everyone try the Kool-Aid. And it was already like kind of a weird atmosphere. Like, I remember also during the first week, like on the second day, they had everyone stand up and say why they liked working here. It's like, I've been here a day. What the hell do I know about working here? But so anyway, like, even before we were offered Kool-Aid, it already seemed weird. And first of all, who the hell is famous for their Kool-Aid besides Jim Jones? And this was already feeling like kind of a weird coterie group of people. And I was feeling very uncomfortable and very much like an outsider, which I think that's normal starting a new job. But so I went through this training, and I've mentioned before that I got diagnosed with really pretty severe inattentive type ADHD, and this training was one of the least ADHD friendly things I'd experienced in my lifetime. And maybe that's on me because I didn't want to tell them I had ADHD because I was afraid of losing my job. I just tried to act like I was totally normal and hope that soon I could get insurance and get treated for ADHD. Which, if I could just act normal at will, then I wouldn't have ADHD. So this training, it was a lot of like, okay, here's how you take attendance. Go to this website and type in your name and login, then go here and here. And they would show a few slideshows and just very, going over a lot of stuff really quickly, and I'm not following any of it. And a lot of like, they had this very innovative way that they write lesson plans where they take the state standards and work backwards. And I remember we were practicing doing that, and it was really hard for me to figure out how that translated to actually writing a lesson plan and being in a classroom. And I was very confused and just trying to look busy and look like I knew what I was doing. It was, not the kind of situation you want to find yourself in when you're also a first year teacher, which really I am. I mean, I know I taught in China, but everything was so different. And I was not like, this is my classroom, I am the teacher of this classroom at any point. I was the English teacher for the whole school, or I was teaching English at an after school program. That's very different. I'm sure any teacher can tell you that. So I'm a first year teacher, really, and I don't know what's going on. I making, a lot of mistakes and not sure how to do anything and not sure what the school policy is for all this stuff. And my kids show up, and I feel like I was extremely unprepared for the level of misbehavior that I saw. I'm talking about things like screaming F you at me or flipping me off if I ask you to sit down. I'm talking about beating up kids so bad that I'm worried they're going to need to go to the hospital. I'm talking about throwing temper tantrums where you are throwing things all over the classroom and screaming and crying. And in the midst of this, I'm trying to teach these lessons, which, part of this school's philosophy is we really need to help these kids get a leg up so that they can get scholarships and get into college. Yes, we're already thinking about that in kindergarten. That's how we work. We really need to do very hardworking, lessons right from the get-go. And so I'm doing lessons in kind of a format that would be okay for teaching high schoolers about trigonometry, but when you're trying to teach kindergartners to count to 3, they're having a hard time staying interested in following it, and it just feels like fitting a square peg through a round hole. And this is on top of all the misbehavior I'm seeing and having to stop the class every couple of minutes because someone is doing something that if I don't address it now, someone's going to get hurt. And really, this is not a situation, I have worked in education for almost 15 years now. And this is not, I've worked with difficult children before. I've worked with children who were having all kinds of things that shouldn't happen to anyone happen to them, and trying to work through that. And the number one thing that I've always had is someone who I can say, hey, so-and-so needs to take a moment to cool down. We need to talk to him. I'm going to go talk to him for a while and help him work through what he's going through. can you watch the rest of the class? Or, I'm going to watch the class, can you take so and so on a walk and talk to him? I was absolutely alone. It was me and 26 kids. Every once in a while, the teacher's aide from the other kindergarten class next door would pop her head in. The other kindergarten class was being run by a long-term sub who was working on her teaching credential, but unless I'm mistaken, hadn't gotten it yet. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. She might have a teaching credential because I don't think you can be a long-term sub without a teaching credential. So anyway, the TA was almost always in her class. Every once in a while would pop her head into mine. I was told that we were supposed to share the TA. I later heard from a TA that she was never told she was supposed to do anything with my class. And I guess that's a good way to transition into the next part, which, I've watched a lot of Why I Quit Teaching YouTubes by this point, and a lot of them are like the administration wasn't helping, it was awful, they were, doing all these horrible things. And I don't really feel that way about my administration. I feel like it was more like the chemistry wasn't there, we were just not able to connect eye to eye. I was not able to appropriately explain what I was not getting, and they were not able to intuit what I wasn't getting. And I was really struggling with this class and not feeling like they were willing and able to support me. I was every day having situations where I think most seasoned veteran teachers would say, oh, you should have, sent some kids out of the room or sent someone in there from admin to kind of take control of the class. And I couldn't do either of those things because everyone was so busy. We were short-staffed. The day that I quit, it was the day that we were seeing 115-degree heat in Sacramento. The power went out to half the school. And so, I had kids doing things like fighting. I was worried someone was going to get hurt. And I tried to call someone to get them sent out of the classroom, and they said, well, third grade is using my room right now. There's nothing I can do. You're going to have to just keep them separated and call home. It was a situation, and I was very, one thing I want to say is, if you don't tell me good job, that makes me assume I'm not doing a good job. Like, I'm always going to assume that I have no sort of self-efficacy. I generally feel like what I'm doing is subpar unless I'm really given a lot of praise. That's just how I'm wired and how I've always been, and it's something I'm working on personally, but also, when I'm not hearing that from administration enough, I'm going to assume that I'm the problem. And I heard that I was the problem from this administration. On the day that I actually quit, it was actually the day after the power went out to half the school. And I had kids fighting. I could not, they told me, oh, if you have two kids fighting, just get between them and try to do a football defense. Kids run faster around me than I'm able to block them. They were on top of each other. I was in this dilemma situation where They say don't pick up the kids ever. That's the last resort, and you need to have special training to do it. But at the same time, if I pick them up, there's this chance I could hurt them, so don't do it. But also, if I just let them duke it out, there's also a chance they could get hurt. So I had this real dilemma on my hands, and I felt like there was no good answer, and that was the day that I decided I was going to leave. After I turned in my resignation, that's when I started hearing other people saying, hey, this is a tough school. You're doing your best. If you think your class is tough, you should see my class. And seeing that, the other students in the other classrooms and the other teachers in the other classrooms weren't perfect. I was setting the bar really high for myself and not being realistic. And there's only so much I can do about that. So I don't think I was the best teacher either, but I also feel like I was doing a lot better than I thought I was. And unfortunately, at that point, I'd already turned in my 2 weeks. I did talk to someone from admin and try to get that rescinded. That was not a fun meeting for me, One of the things when I quit, I didn't want to say why I'm quitting. So I said, yeah, I just feel like my skill set is maybe better geared toward a substitute. And she said, I'm not sure with your skill set that you would even be a good substitute, which is a pretty mean thing to say. So I'm no longer working at that school. Now I have an apartment in San Diego, so I'm kind of stuck here. And I'm currently in the process of getting sub work and hoping that things work out. It was not a great situation, but quitting was maybe not a great idea. But also I feel like, I was going through every why teachers quit video or why I quit teaching video that you find on YouTube. And I think there's thousands by this point. All of them recreate all the things they say are things that I think I experienced some of. Again, not so much like admin not having my back, but I feel like with the admin of that school, it was more of a unable than an unwilling thing. But things like feeling very lonely and like I didn't have any free time and like I wasn't appreciated and like parents were out to get me and I had a lot of wonderful parents. So I don't want to say otherwise. And like students figured out what would get me angry and would push my buttons on purpose because it was funny and those kinds of situations that I was finding myself in and getting very little sleep. I mentioned that I was sleeping too much at one job. This time I was only getting like 3 hours of sleep a night because I was just so anxious about everything. There are so many things you need to worry about as a teacher. And unfortunately, I feel like I was really unaware of how much time it takes to be a good teacher. How you really, I was showing up to that job somewhere between 6 and 6:30 in the a.m. I was often the last one to leave at 6 p.m. And I've heard a lot of people say that's what teaching is. That's just how it works. But I really feel like with the right guidance, I could be a very good teacher. And even, my father said, you're a great teacher. You're just a lousy disciplinarian, which, that might sound like kind of a mean thing to say, but I agree with it. And frankly, I don't want to be a good disciplinarian. My hero is Fred Rogers. I don't think he was known as a great disciplinarian. Joseph Stalin, probably an awesome disciplinarian. I don't know much about how he was with his kids, but my point still stands. Anyway, I've talked long enough. Thanks a lot for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. And hopefully the next time I see you, I'll be feeling better. One more thing that I did want to mention before I go, one thing I've been hearing from a lot of friends and family when I do run into them is, "Oh, aren't you glad you got out of China? What a crummy place." And I think a good analogy would be like if someone just got out of a relationship that started off really strong and you had all these hopes and dreams and you thought, "Oh, this might be the one," and then things just kind of fall apart. I think if you were in that situation, maybe you have been in that situation, hearing people say, "Oh, aren't you glad you ditched that awful person?" It's kind of like, no, I, everything that I had invested in my life kind of turned sour very quickly. And now I feel really upset. I am really not happy to have left China. That wasn't the way I wanted to leave. And this isn't the way I wanted to be in the United States. And, I feel like, "Oh, aren't you glad you got out of there?" is not really the thing to say to somebody who's currently hit rock bottom, pushing 40, no idea what they're going to do with their life, no savings. But now it's time to climb up.